Charles Swanston was born here at Berwick-upon-Tweed on the English-Scotland border of Northumberland in 1789 to a well-to-do British family. At 16 years old, Charles was trained and commissioned to be a lieutenant in the British militia and sent to India to be part of the South East India Company. The South East India Company was a colonising militia group often known as adventurous merchants. While Swanston was in India, he was trained at the Military Institute at Fort St George. What's interesting about this town was Fort St George was secured by the British in 1640. It was a pivotal moment as it marked the first time Indian land was owned by the British. The settlement that grew around Fort St George became known as the thriving city of Madras, now known as Chennai. It was in this settlement Swanston gained his military and colonising education. In 1810, Swanston was a member of an expedition which obtained the political overthrow and colonising of Mauritius, and was appointed to survey the island. It was in this colonised settlement where Swanston learnt about indentured labourship. We know slavery was eradicated from the empire in 1835, but little did we know that in India and Australia, the empire was rapidly developing and needed a workforce. The slave labour had to be replaced with something, and it was too politically insensitive to use slaves. So slavery was replaced with indentured servitudes. Slaves who had their lives in danger were rescued by the British. However, this new agreement was similar to slavery, except the people going into this were signing a form of agreement, many of the slaves having no clue what they were signing. The island of Mauritius was chosen as the first site in the empire to do this. And I'm sure Charles Swanston learnt every step of the way. In September 1817, back in India, Charles was ordered to raise 1,000 men for the Poona Auxiliary Horse Brigade and was appointed commander. In command of these troops, he was involved in the Battle of Corrigayon and was wounded in battle 3 times. In the aftermath to the battle, which left the company in control of most of India, he captured Trimbakji Dengal, a Marathi leader on whose head the British had placed a price of £10,000. In January 1819, Swanston was promoted captain. History reports that Charles got ill and had to leave his post in India and retreat to Van Diemen's Land with his family. However, some suggest this savvy merchant and military commander was hand-picked by Van Diemen's Land Governor George Arthur to use his experience.
Fire at will!
Relationship with the Van Diemen's Land Indigenous had failed and led to heavy violence. To maintain order, Governor Arthur declared martial law, effectively providing legal immunity for killing Aboriginal people. He needed experienced fighters to take control, and in November 1830, this organised force commenced a massive 6-week military offensive known as the Black Line. Now, did Charles assist with this? The line of militia included 2,200 civilians, predominantly ex-convicts, farmers, anyone who had experience in hunting. Of course, the police and soldiers were involved. They formed a series of moving cordons stretching hundreds of kilometres across the island in order to drive Aboriginal people from the colony's settled districts to the Tasman Peninsula in the southeast, where it was intended they would remain permanently confined. Many of the early landholders, or squatters, were recruited to be captains in this bush militia. I'll speak about them in future episodes, but this was just the training ground for future invasions. In November 1831, Swanston was appointed Managing Director of the Derwent Bank, and it was in this role he worked with Governor George Arthur and drew upon his own training and experience to form a new syndicate of adventurous merchants called the Port Phillip Association. Charles then used his Indian and British contacts to bring much needed financial investment into Van Diemen's Land to fund the invasion into Port Phillip and South Australia. His largest investor was the extremely wealthy and influential Scottish millionaire George Mercer of Edinburgh. George was financially invested in the South East India Company, but sold his shares to invest in the new Port Phillip Association. Without George's and the other foreign investment, and the Van Diemen's Land squatters' investment, this business deal, invasion, wouldn't have been funded. But before the deal could be legal, Charles knew in the colonising playbook of India and Mauritius, he needed to get a brave, cunning and ruthless person to help arrange a treaty. Swanston knew John Batman was the perfect pawn for the task, not only ruthless, but so full of himself and experienced at telling tall stories in the pub, he would be perfect for paving the way for the association to invade Port Phillip. With the questionable treaty signed, all that was needed to possess the land was to have cattle on the land, so the Port Phillip Association, including the governor's nephew, Henry Arthur, arranged for an armada of ships to take the cattle, shepherds and resources required over to Port Phillip. One of the ships was built specifically and named after Henry Arthur. The point where they landed in Port Phillip was also named after him, Point Henry. However, as Point Henry was not an official port, there were no official records of the multitudes of ship arrivals and departures that year. I wonder why. But thanks to the Port Phillip Association records and the records of the Launceston Customs, we know how many times these ships departed from Launceston, heading for Port Phillip. There were hundreds of voyages, hundreds of thousands of sheep. It's also because of these records that I discovered how my ancestor came across from Launceston on the Champion with W.J.T. Clark. The ex-convicts, like my ancestor Thomas, under an indentured servitude with W.J.T. Clark as a shepherd, were given the prospect of getting their freedom. All they had to do was protect the sheep and this newly stolen land, and their faithfulness would be rewarded with land. Often the shepherds were put into a lone hut, armed only with a musket, and ordered to defend the land and the sheep, only ever shooting to kill in self-defence. Whilst on paper, this wasn't a war, Port Phillip effectively became the new frontier in the Tasmanian War. However, this land grab and business enterprise doesn't last long, as Governor Burke and the New South Wales government declared the association's treaty as illegal. This was primarily because it goes against their own terra nullius agreement, which says the land was vacant when they colonised New South Wales. The New South Wales government then orders all the stolen land to be sold off for a nominal fee back from the squatters. At this time, the international investors of the Port Phillip Association get a massive return on their investment. Then the region is then seen to be peacefully taken over by the British Empire. The members of the Port Phillip Association are conveniently pardoned, and with the money from their investment in the association purchase massive amounts of land. The Port Phillip Association dissolves, and the rest is history. Charles Swanston held a massive part of the Bellarine in an area known as Paywit. Penwheat, from whom we get the name Paywit, was the name of one of the elders of the Biangala clan that roamed this part of the Bellarine. Penwit, along with his two wives, Memania and Barngok, and their two children, lost their land and their freedom the day the Port Phillip Association came and took their land for merino farms. Willis and Swanston controlled several properties in Western Victoria, totalling over 150,000 acres. Today there's no record of the parish of Paywit, it's now known as St Leonard's, or any remnants of Paywit and his Biangala clan. And unfortunately for all the land gains Swanston seemed to have made, life really didn't end well for him either. By 1849, Swanston's empire was crumbling around him. Sheep and lamb prices were low and the gold rush had started. So Charles found himself in thousands of pounds of debt, and in 1850 he left Australia for the California goldfields to visit family. before coming back soon after disappointed. It is assumed that he took his own life on board the Raven on his return to Sydney on the 5th of September 1850 and was buried at sea. And today, if you go to Queenscliff, Geelong or Melbourne, you'll see Swanston Street named after Charles. But the Acute Mental Health and Psychiatric Centre, known as the Swanston Centre in Geelong, is probably the most appropriately named.